Great. So again, thank you all for joining us today for the April 2018 Segal Program Convening, which is about applying to work in the federal government with some information and wisdom from a Segal Fellow and a Segal Founder on why they've chosen to work in the federal government and some tips on applying. The mission of the Segal program is to foster the next generation of citizen leaders, and we have these monthly convenings to bring Segal Fellows and Founders and other people together. I know we have some non-Segal Network connected folks. We're always happy to connect with new people that are also trying to foster that next generation of citizen leaders. So these are virtual chances for us to gather in between the times that we gather in person, and times for us to talk and think about development, reflection, content that's relevant for people. And we know that there's a lot of excitement today in hearing from our speakers. So we'll be hearing from Segal founder Marlene Zakai, who has been a long-time program supporter, fellow supervisor, helped to get the partnership going in general, and support and supervise our fellows at the Corporation for National and Community Service, and worked with Eli Segal. She's currently the Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Corporation for National and Community Service, and I'll let her share a little bit more about the past and future of her impressive years of career there. And we also get to hear from Segal Fellow Margaret Levy, who joined in 2008 as a Heller Segal Fellow and is the Management and Program Analyst in Budget Service at the U.S. Department of Education, who got her start in the federal government through the Presidential Management Fellowship. So we're really thankful to hear from you two today, and I'll turn it over to you all. Marlene, you can introduce yourself first.
Okay, thank you, Susie, and I'm happy to be here, being able to help shape the Segal Fellow program here at the corporation and supervise almost all of our fellows over the years has really been a highlight of my career. I had the good fortune to work with Eli for probably about a year and a half. When I first came to the corporation, and I was really struck by his ability to bring in young people into his circle and include them both in the conversation and in the decision making. And when Eli passed away, I was part of a conversation with our leadership about how we could honor Eli's memory, and the decision was made to set up this fellowship. And I have gone on to manage the fellowship in the years since. All of my federal career has been here at the Corporation for National and Community Service. I am here because I'm passionate about the work, and in the agency, while I came in a mid-management position, I have served in probably 6 or 7 senior management positions during the time that I have worked in the agency. So I think that is just sort of the piece of intro that I wanted to give before we get going and talking more specifically about federal government. Is that good, Susie?
That's great. Thanks. And Margaret, we'll look forward to hearing from you.
Yeah, thanks. So I have also spent my entire federal career in one agency at the Department of Education. I think we'll touch on this a little bit more, but that's quite rare. And I joined the department as a Presidential Management Fellow in August of 2009. And I can talk a little bit more about the PMF program later, but it's a fellowship program for people coming out of grad school to help train the next generation of federal leaders. And I've had a couple roles inside the department. I started in our risk management service and then moved briefly to the Race to the Top team, which is working on one of President Obama's signature education reform efforts. And I have now been with our budget service for 6.5 years almost, working on drafting the president's budget, working with grant program offices within the department, and coordinating with Congress and the Office of Management and Budget.
Well, thank you for sharing more about an introduction. For the content that we have for today, I've asked Margaret and Marlene to talk a bit about the why. Why did they choose to work in the federal government, and why might you, as someone interested in continuing to be a citizen leader, choose to work in the federal government? So we'll hear from each of them a little bit about that. And then we will get into a couple of general tips on the process of applying to work in the federal government. So Marlene, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, thank you, Susie. So I think I'd like to begin by saying that I never planned to work in federal government. And after a career in 24 years of doing this, I'm still surprised that this is where I landed for well more than half of my career. My choice to join federal government was because I was, from a policy perspective, completely certain that the introduction of the AmeriCorps program, and by the way, for those of you who may not know, my agency is responsible for the AmeriCorps State and National Program, the NCCC program, AmeriCorps Vista, and all of our senior, senior service programs. And I was absolutely certain that the introduction of the AmeriCorps program was a great benefit to our country. And having come out of working with young people for several years, I knew that there would be extensive interest in participating, and I wanted to be a part of the development. And that was why I chose to come here. What I have found is a tremendous range of opportunity, as well as financial benefits that at the time I joined federal government, and even up to maybe the last 5 years or so, I hadn't really paid all that much attention to. And I will talk a little bit more about the benefits, a little bit more about the opportunities later. But in terms of the financial benefits, the federal government offers, for the most part, stability, still the opportunity for a pension and an employer matching program on a 401k, as well as great other kinds of benefits like health benefits and commuter benefits and things like that. I really hadn't, that wasn't the reason that I chose to go into federal service, but certainly over the years, I came to greatly appreciate what the federal government had to offer in terms of those kinds of benefits as well. And I think that's all I'm going to say now, and then and turn it over to Margaret. Susie, is that okay?
Sounds good.
So I have worked, I guess, my whole life in government. Before working for the federal government and before going to Heller, I worked for a state senator in Massachusetts doing healthcare policy. I've really always been interested in education policy, and the reason I was interested in working, well, I guess I should say I wasn't really interested in working for the federal government. I was interested in working for government because there are a lot of great education programs, but a lot of them are really small, and I've always been concerned about how do you get those great services to all kids who need them, not just kids who happen to live in a particular area or have access to one great school or program. So from that perspective, government made a lot of sense. But education is largely a state level issue. The federal role is actually quite small. We mostly just give money to states, grant money. So in 2009, when I was graduating from Heller, it was the beginning of the recession, and it was difficult to find public service jobs. And the Presidential Management Fellowship gave me a great opportunity to work for the federal government. And I got a position at the Department of Education, which was wonderful. And so I think for my interests, government is the right place to be. It's the right focus. And for the type of work that I like doing and my particular policy interests. But I always like to warn people that it really isn't for everyone. I think it's great, but it is a huge bureaucracy. And if you're not comfortable with bureaucracy, it can be a really frustrating place to work. That said, I really like figuring out ways to work within the bureaucracy and understand why rules are in place. And I think that kind of makes work interesting. It sometimes makes it frustrating, but it's something important to know if you're considering a career in federal government or any government, I think.
Thanks. Anything else that you guys wanted to respond to on the why that you've heard each other say that you wanted to share more about?
I would add that there are, in the public, there's quite a misperception about federal employees. You know, while we do work in large, complex organizations that the public or the media may consider to be less than optimally functional, I would say that the benefits of working in a large, complex organization give you the opportunity to learn how systems work, and to learn how an idea becomes a law, becomes an implemented set of activities in our among our citizens. And lastly, I would say that in our agency, and I would bet it's the same at Department of Education, I know that it rings true for places like HHS and the Peace Corps. People are passionate about the mission, and people who are passionate about the mission have a lot in common personally, despite all their differences, and largely because of the diversity and because of the opportunity to really do something that they feel is meaningful and do it together. So I think the federal government is a great place to work. And I think that a lot of times federal employees get a bad rap publicly.
I would absolutely second that. I think federal agencies are very mission driven, which is not the first word that usually comes to mind when people think of the federal government, but most people who work here are absolutely committed to their agency's mission and to their role, and are really working to make life better for people in the country, which is hugely important. I think also, although many federal employees work for the government for a long time, they move around a lot. So people aren't stuck in one place. They don't get as worn down, I think, as stereotypes would indicate. I think there's still a lot of energy, and people are really, really committed to doing the best job that they can.
Thank you both for sharing that. And we'll just pause briefly here before we dive into some general tips on applying to see if anyone on the call has questions or thoughts to share about the why. Either why Marlene or Margaret have chosen to work in and stay in the federal government over time, or questions you have about the why piece of applying to work in the federal government. All right, then we will let people think about questions. I know we warned you, we were saving a lot of time for Q&As at the end, and we'll dive into a little bit on general tips of applying to the federal government. And I appreciate Marlene and Margaret that you guys have each spent some time over the last 2 weeks thinking about what you wanted to share today. So Marlene, I believe we were gonna start with you.
Okay, so the first thing I would say, similar to any other sector that you might be interested in entering, it's really a good idea to speak with people who are currently working in that sector. And so if you have the opportunity through your network and maybe through the Brandeis Network is one avenue to find someone working in federal government, and if you can find someone working at the agency that you're interested in or doing the kind of job you're interested in, learning more about that, having some sort of a contact interview with people or a networking interview is really a good thing to do. It helps you learn the lingo, the federal government lingo. It will also help you learn a little bit about the agency approach to hiring. And you can learn this also in other places, and I'll talk about that. But just to say that there are some things that are common across federal government in hiring, and then there's some things that are slightly different. Margaret and I, when we chatted about what we were going to talk about, we discovered that the way we do hiring is different than the way her department or agency does hiring. And you can also learn that from the government has a central web presence for all jobs in federal government called usadjobs.gov. And there you will find pretty much every job that is available in federal government anywhere in the world. And you can read all about the qualifications and the process and the documents that need to be submitted in order to apply. What I would say is that there are a lot of interesting job titles in federal government. You could be a program analyst, a program officer, a program manager. You could be a policy analyst, a policy manager, a budget analyst, a budget director, a budget deputy director. And agencies have different names for the same work. What I have learned in federal government is what's much more important is the substance of the work and not the title. Because there are reasons that things are titled the way they are that may not necessarily have something to do directly with the content of the work. So pay a lot of attention to what is described in the duties when you look at the jobs. As Margaret mentioned, your first job in federal government may not be your last. Once you're inside of federal government, it's a lot easier to apply for other jobs in federal government and to move around. And it is not uncommon to find people who have either worked in several different agencies within a large federal agency or who have moved from organization from HHS to Department of Ed or to the Office of Management and Budget, et cetera. You do find that's a fairly frequent theme that people have moved around, and usually moving around means moving up a little bit as well. I would say that looking at the USA Jobs website, I had the experience of opening up the website and saying, wow, I haven't looked at this in a while. It looks completely different. So the federal government is constantly trying to catch up with the rest of the world in technology. So pay attention to the fact that sometimes things move around on the website. And I will talk in a little while. I'm going to let Margaret talk, and then I will give a few key points about actually doing the search on the USA Jobs website.
Great.
Margaret?
Yeah, great. Thanks. I think it's really important to read some of the postings, even if they're not jobs you're interested in, to get familiar with the way job descriptions are written on USA Jobs. there are a lot of words and a lot of kind of government speak, and it takes a little while to get familiar with that and to really understand what a job actually is. Again, highlights Marlene's point about going on informational interviews or talking to people in agencies that you're interested in. One other warning, even before you apply, you should be aware it takes a long time. So don't get discouraged. When I was applying, people said, oh, it can take 6 months. And I was thinking, that's ridiculous. No way, it could take 6 months. I can't apply for a job when I'm just finishing, my first semester of second year of grad school, but it can take that long. So just be aware of that. I think, let's see, should I go over some of the tips with USA Jobs, Marlene, or did you want to?
Yeah, anything, you go ahead and cover whatever you have on your list, and then I'll fill in if there's something else that I have to say.
One tip for USA Jobs that's really helpful, you can set saved searches that will notify you if there are any new postings. The saved searches expire, but I think they usually tell you when it's expiring so you can renew it. But if you're interested in an agency or in an office within an agency, that would be really helpful. I think it's probably less helpful for searching on job titles since those can vary and agencies don't necessarily use the same job title for the same type of work. Also, a lot of work is done in different agencies. Similar work is done in different agencies. There are a lot of childhood programs in the Department of Education, but also HHS, and then USAID has international children's programs. If you're interested in international work, there are a number of different kind of foreign service opportunities at the State Department, USAID. Department of Agriculture also has a foreign program. So it's helpful to look around a little bit and see if the work that you're interested in is happening in an agency you may not have initially thought of. Let's see. I think that's pretty good. There are, the revised USA Jobs has made it easier to search for jobs for different types of people. So if you're a veteran, there are opportunities. If you're already in the federal government, there are other opportunities that are only open to federal employees. If you are a returning Peace Corps volunteer or VISTA alum, there are also opportunities that are open to you. So those are places to look. I would also encourage you to look into different fellowships. Presidential Management Fellowship is a big one, but there are also a number of other fellowships that make it a little easier to get into the federal government.
Great, thanks, Margaret.
Federal government agencies also offer internships. Sometimes they're paid, sometimes they're not. Over the years, I have supervised numerous volunteers who have worked here on non-paid internships during the summer. I also know, for example, that our general counsel office has frequently hired a summer legal intern and had funds to pay them. Regardless of if you're interested in getting into federal government, most of those are listed also on USA Jobs. And if you scroll down on the homepage towards the bottom, there's a link for internships and fellowships, and you should take or students. Sorry, it's called Students and Recent Grads. And and you'll find the Presidential Management Fellows program there, as well as any other internships. And we have had students come. Don't underestimate the opportunity to create an opportunity. I had on 2 separate occasions professors from different universities reach out to me and say, you know, I have a student who is really interested in your agency and who I think would be great. Would you have any willingness to consider an unpaid internship? And in those cases, in at least one of those cases, the fellow was able to find their own grant money, and we created the internship opportunity, and she came here from Indiana. It would be helpful if someone who has, I'm going to use the word credibility, someone who has credibility to reach out to a federal agency and say, I have someone who I think would make a good placement in your agency, as opposed to you calling the agency and saying, I would like to come do an internship. I also wanted to say that while you're searching USA jobs, Margaret alluded to the fact that the hiring process in federal government can take a long time. In our agency, we try and keep it to 3 months, but I was just recently talking with someone who said that their hiring process takes 9 months. If you are on the USA Jobs website and it's not an unpaid internship and you see something on a very short timeline, let's say it's only going to be open for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a month, it might not be actually broadly available. That's actually a tool that federal agencies use when they have a very narrow pool of people that they are expecting to apply. And so I would sort of be cautious about having great expectations if you apply for one of those jobs that's on a very short timeline. The other thing I'd like to say is that federal government gets its money, most of federal government, although not all, most of federal government gets its money from congressionally appropriated funds. There are a few agencies that are exceptions because they collect fees, agencies that service, for example, credit unions, I think parts of the Federal Communications Commission, but almost everybody else is dependent on federal appropriations. If you are watching the news and see that either there are threats of a government shutdown or we're going into a continuing resolution known as a CR, many times federal agencies are very conservative about hiring when there is concern about when the full appropriation might be available. And so if you apply while federal government is under a CR, you might expect there's a possibility that the hiring process will take even a little bit longer. When we were under the most recent CR or series of CRs that ended in March, we did the only hiring we did from October 1 until that point in early March was urgent hiring of a mission critical position. And that would be, for example, a budget director who actually manages the agency's budget of federal appropriations. So those were the things that I wanted to say. One other thing is that I noticed that at the very bottom of the USA Jobs homepage, there is a link to events, and the federal government is now hosting webinars and other kinds of online events to talk to people who are interested in federal government service and to address how to fill out this kind of form when you're applying and how to do this when you're applying. And I would strongly recommend that you take advantage of those opportunities. They were not available until recently, and I think it's a great addition. That's all that I had to add.
Thanks for sharing that, Marlene. And I think one of the things that you had mentioned, Margaret, was just how things are a little bit different with federal government jobs in terms of the way you write your resume or the way you do your interview. And I know, as Marlene said, there are specific webinars from the federal government that can help think about that. But I was wondering if there was anything else either of you wanted to add on that front, and also about, you know, the specific lingo that you'll need to know and use.
Well, I do have one other point that I wanted to make that is somewhat of tangentially related to what you just asked, and that is, you know, it's always a good idea when you put together your resume and when you present yourself in an interview to talk about your work and your experience in terms of the skill sets that you bring, as opposed to the actual work that you did, which people will ask about. But ultimately, we are all looking, when we're looking for a job, to do the translation of the things that I know how to do best and that I want to learn more about doing, and the job that awaits me. And so when you fill out your resume, be thinking about that, and be thinking, and as you apply to these jobs, be thinking about your volunteer work, whether it was national service through an AmeriCorps position, or whether it was, you know, running a spring break program or your ongoing tutoring that you do. And don't discount the value of the skills, the passion, and the dedication that that kind of work brings, and make sure that it's reflected in your resume and in your job application for federal service.
Thanks, Marlene.
I'd like to add, when you had the USA Jobs site up a minute ago, there was a little thing on the bottom that said, myth, you know, robots are scanning your resume for keywords. And it said that it was, USA Jobs seemed to be saying that's not really true, but they said it is 50% true. And at the Department of Education, it is pretty much true. Your resume will, at Ed, this may be different from agency to agency, but generally your resume is read by human resources specialists who aren't necessarily familiar with the details of the specific job. They're not the ones who will be supervising you, so they're not maybe not as clear on exactly what the office is looking for. So it is important that your resume reflect keywords in the job description and in the qualifications, and make sure that you can repeat them as many times. My federal resume is not at all written for non-federal eyes. It's kind of a bunch of gobbledygook, but it does reflect the jobs that I've applied for and the experiences that I've had in those jobs. That's not to say that no one who has any idea what you've done or can interpret your resume will ever look at it. It just means to make the first cut, it's important to make sure that you cite your experience in the same way that it's written in the job description, and so that you can get to that subject matter expert, is what they call it. It's usually someone who will be your supervisor, so that when they look at your resume, they can actually see the work that you've done. If you get an interview, the interview might feel a little strange. I know for most jobs at education, the interviewer has to ask all applicants the same question to ensure that the process is fair, that they can ask follow-up questions based on what you've said, but they go into it with a list of questions and they'll ask the same questions of each applicant that they interview. So it may feel a little strange, or they'll ask questions that are clearly answered in your resume. So don't be nervous about that. Just answer the questions that they ask. If you have a phone interview and then an in-person interview, they may ask the same questions again. And again, that feels a little weird, but the reason they're doing it is to make sure that the process is fair for everyone and everyone has the opportunity to answer the same questions.
Thanks, Margaret. And I know each of you spoke a little bit to the idea of the language that they're searching for, the specific terminology to use, and the fact that using your networks to talk with people is a really powerful way to just talk to more people who are in the federal government, are in that particular department or agency, and can help you think not only about what it would be like to work there, but the important language and content to know about as well.
I had one other thing that I wanted two very short things. We forgot to mention it, but it is always a good idea to spend time on the website of the federal agency that you are planning on applying to for a job. You'll learn a tremendous amount. There'll be a lot of layers. Dig, play around, look at as much as you can. I was just involved in hiring for one of our senior executives here in the building, and it really is quite stunning when you interview 7 individuals, 5 of whom come in asking significant questions about the agency, which they could have only gleaned from doing research, and 2 of them asked absolutely nothing about the agency. That says something about your initiative and your interest in the work. So I wanted to say that. And then the other thing I wanted to point out is that there are publications online that address working in federal government. One of them is called the Federal Times, and it's federaltimes.com, and it's an open publication. I just pulled it up and, to see what was on there today. And you'll find some interesting things like no snow days for teleworking government employees, for example. There are other specific to agencies. There's something on Veterans Affairs. There's something on Homeland Security and what's going on there, federal retirement questions, financial advice for federal employees. There's all kinds of great things on there. And also, there's a nonprofit called the Partnership for Public Service, which is a nonprofit that encourages people to go into the public sector and celebrates the work of federal employees with a series of national awards called the Sammys. And it's a pretty prestigious award. People get nominated from all over federal government for their work. But they hold all kinds of seminars, webinars, and they have all kinds of good stuff on their website. I would encourage you to take a look at that as well.
Thanks, Marlene. Well, at this point, I'll just pause briefly for questions and see if there are any questions that our participants want to throw out.
Hi, yes, this is Sylvia. I have a question for Marlene. So I have applied for a state program officer position with CNCS, and I've made it past the first kind of 2 benchmarks, and I'm working on narrative responses now. Do you have any tips for writing the narrative responses?
So since you're applying for a job in our agency, I really shouldn't answer, because I would be giving you an unfair advantage over others. And I don't know what the content of those particular questions are. But if you are not familiar with the work of a state office, more than just a passing familiarity, I would suggest that you consider picking up the phone and calling the state office in your state. Where are you located?
I'm located in Massachusetts right now, but I'm applying for the position in Tennessee.
Well, you could certainly call the state office in Massachusetts and in Boston, and see if you could have a conversation with them just to learn more about the job that they do. I wouldn't ask them for tips on writing your answers because, again, it's conflict of interest for us. But talking, I think learning more in depth what they do might help you with your answers.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Sylvia. Any other questions or comments from anyone else on the call? Or other key things you want to share for those that will be listening in with you or watching the recording later? I know, Tony, you said this is a part of what you do as well. So if there are other points that you wanted to throw into the conversation, we would welcome that too.
I wanted to add that the federal government now has a relationship with a university. I'm blanking which school it is right now, but for an online graduate degree. And I think that the courses are deeply, deeply discounted. And that's just another benefit. The federal government is always adding new kinds of benefits for its employees.
Thanks. And while we think of whether there are any other questions, I just wanted to loop back a little bit to what's been most satisfying for each of you about choosing to make a large chunk of your career in the federal government as well. I know, Margaret, when we were preparing for this call, you said that you'd always been interested in education policy, but really were interested in figuring out how to scale up the work that you do. And Marlene, you mentioned a couple of other things, but as people on the call live or watching the call later think about the various ways that they can be a citizen leader from any sector, wearing any hat, what's one more thing you would say about why to really consider choosing to go into the federal government?
Well, I would say, this is Marlene, I would say that there are two things that I would add. One is that I have met the most amazing people. And I have worked with really smart, really dedicated people, both who are federal civil servants as well as people who have been appointed by administrations on both sides of the aisle. I have learned how government works, which is not something that I probably would know much about if I were not working in federal government. And lastly, I would say that I have had the opportunity to travel this country in my job and become familiar with this country through the neediest communities in our country. And it has been an education and a blessing that I have the opportunity to do this kind of work and in a small way to make a difference in people's lives and in the opportunities that they have.
Thanks, Marlene.
I think that's true. I think I've loved being able to interact with so many different people, with Congress, with Office of Management and Budget, with our program offices in the department, with Native American tribes. I work on Indian education programs, with preschool programs, and just being able to see how the work that you do impacts all of these different people has really been incredible. And I don't think that's an experience you get if you don't work for the federal government. It's very hard to have that breadth of impact. And sometimes it's hard to see how deep your impact goes, but it's really, I mean, for me personally, as Susie mentioned, again, I'm really interested in scale up. And so being able to work with different programs and find solutions that work across a variety of different settings has been a really valuable experience.
Thank you. Just pause one more time to see if there are any other questions, but then I will give some thank yous. All right, well, I know that we always say that there are so many ways to make a difference through your official role and what you do in your work and through all the other things that you do informally and all the hats that you wear. But we know that many of our fellows and many of our founders, and for a chunk of his life, Eli Segal as well, made an impact through the federal government. So we really appreciate being able to hear one perspective on why to work in the federal government and how to apply from Margaret and Marlene, bringing that Segal Fellow and Segal Founder perspective to the fore today. So thanks to everyone who joined us, and thanks so much, Margaret and Marlene, for taking us through some thoughts on today's topic.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Great. And I see several chats coming in saying, thank you for the call. That was really helpful. So thanks to those chatting in too. And for those of you watching online later, you can always reach out to me if you're interested in connecting more with Margaret or Marlene or any other Segal Fellows or founders that you know can help you think about what comes next for you. So I hope everybody has a great rest of the day, and thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.